Good morning, everybody, honourable ministers, your excellencies, distinguished guests, distinguished hosts, ladies and gentlemen. Very pleased to be here, and as you say in Namibia, malalepo. My name is Michael Baer, and my presentation is very much geared towards the experience that the United Kingdom has had in the delivery of infrastructure in PPPs, and the lessons that we have learned along the way. So I've structured it in 6 parts: brief introduction, the journey, our PPPs, the lessons that we've learned, infrastructure delivery through PPP, the why, the what and the how, the institutional appetite for financing infrastructure, following the money, which is so important, and recommendations finally for Namibia. My own background, as Selma mentioned, and Selma, could I thank you very much for that very kind introduction? And I have to say, of all the introductions I've had, yours is the most recent. And I say that because I was the Lord Mayor of the City of London. I made 900 speeches in my year. I was known as a green Lord Mayor, and I did my bit for sustainability by recycling my speeches. But not today, this is a very special occasion. So the UK journey, PPPs, I'll whistle you through this because we're running a bit short of time, but we have, over the last 20 years, we found a mechanism which has worked very successfully in our country in modernising the way in which public infrastructure and services are delivered, and in finding ways of working effectively with the private sector, and forming strategic alliances with the private sector, not always through a PPP model, but sometimes relationships are different. But PPP is a very effective mechanism of procurement for certain projects. In the United Kingdom, we have signed and delivered 679 projects out of the number of signed 722. So we have quite a large portfolio. The ones that haven't quite completed are doing very well. And that is a figure of capital value of £57.7 billion. And it covers all of the sectors, from street lighting, where basically we build the street lights and we rent, the private sector rents them back to the government for a payment per month. And we get paid on how much energy we actually save from the old lighting mechanisms to the more modern LED ones, together with the availability. And the private sector in this particular one is an interesting one. We don't get paid if the lights don't work. So there's a total alignment of interest. And then we have some of the bigger ones in the United Kingdom. We've delivered airports, water projects, energy projects, railways, toll roads. So we have a vast experience in that 722 project list. And we have our own equivalent of what you set up and so eloquently described by Sarab earlier. We have our Infrastructure and Projects Authority. This is our unit which collects best practice and ensures that delivery of infrastructure, not just PPP, but all infrastructure in the United Kingdom, is delivered in an effective, cost-effective and affordable way. And this particular unit reports to the Cabinet Office, so it has the oversight of the Prime Minister. So priority projects get the approval, and everybody knows which are the priority projects. And of course, the Treasury, your finance ministry in your country. And that's to make sure that there is a proper budgetary oversight and decisions are made. So projects that get through have all the ticks in the right boxes. And our purpose is also to continually improve through the IPA, the method of delivery. So we have a 360-degree feedback loop, making sure that any lessons that we need to learn are learned, and that we make sure that we are continually the collectors of best practice. What this IPA group does, another 3 Ps, but they're different ones, we make sure that we understand the complexity of all the projects, and make sure that the risks, as has been mentioned in previous speakers, by previous speakers, are well understood, and that the apportionment of risk between private and public sector are in the right place. PPP is not, as I say, the golden bullet for everything. It's where risks are better placed with the private sector that PPPs are so important. The middle one, people, is equally important. We have to be cleverer than the contractors and the private sector. So we make sure that we train and have within our IPA the best of the best, that they can second guess some of the conditions and criteria that happen in a changing market. And process is about having a process across the full life cycle of a project. It's not just the award of a contract, the monitoring, it's the training, it's the capacity building that goes with it, and ensuring that that process is fit for purpose right throughout the life cycle. These, again, setting out our priorities, setting up projects for success, which I've mentioned, making sure that we set them up in a very robust way, creating market confidence. So any project that gets through the system has got to have the transparency so that the private sector understands that this is a very robust procurement method and that the project is able to be delivered against political priorities, changes in legislation, etc. We build the delivery capability, which I've mentioned, so we have great people in our IPA, and we're able, as I said, the 360 degree, always feeding back performance to make sure that it is successful. So what are the lessons learned? Well, one of the lessons which, listening to the previous presentations, I think would be really interesting, is that in order to get a common agenda, an alignment of interest, we now take an equity stake in many of the really big projects. So the government does. Only a small, could be 10%, could be 15%. And that ensures there's a total alignment of interest, there's a transparency, the flow of information as a shareholder, and that we found was incredibly important because in the original PPPs, there was this glass wall, this separation between the client and the deliverer. And that brought all sorts of suspicion. Well, by being an equity holder, and sometimes that equity could be for free because there are assets that are passing. So that is an encouraging sign that has worked very well. On finance, some of the early PPPs, the finance rate was basically too high. I mean, I know because I delivered them. We would, as a private sector, we would value risk and we'd put a big margin on it. And then as soon as we de-risked it by building the project, we refinanced, and we, the private sector, would take that surplus. Well, now having a more sophisticated way of getting competitive financial terms, that is one of the lessons we've learned, and the government can certainly help. We're shortening the time between tender and delivery. We now do this all within an 18-month period, and that's hugely important because it's, time is cost to the private sector. Open book, I've mentioned, flexible service provision, greater transparency, risk allocation. These are all very important aspects that we have fine-tuned and honed, and happy to share that experience with you. And what we've also done is we've enabled our pension funds and our life companies, our long-term funders, to actually invest in our infrastructure, either PPP or otherwise, because it's an asset class that previously in the United Kingdom was seen as too risky for a life company to take on. But now through the insurance industry, we have completion guarantees that remove the construction and delivery risk and insure against it, which means that the major investors now in our infrastructure and PPPs are our life and insurance companies, and that has allowed us to actually tap a large capital flow, which otherwise was investing in other countries. So we've actually got them very interested in doing that. And of course, strong guidance, lots of lessons on how to ensure value for money, and we have a lot of delivery mechanisms. So on the actual delivery itself, the why, the what, and the how, and you've heard from other speakers, and you hear a lot today, the private sector participation has got these particular aspects to it, from generating value, maintaining control, minimizing risk, including industry best practice. So that is the why use the private sector, and there is a very strong reason so to do. The what, choosing the right model, the optimal model, will come out of rigorous analysis. It has to be market-facing, so right at the top, the market, it has to be demand-driven. The market has to respond to a project and want to deliver and finance it. And then you have the other aspects about financial feasibility, the risk profile, the degree of control that you're passing to the private sector, and of course the scale of it. But getting the optimal model is absolutely fundamental. The key procurement stages are starting on my left, your left, the blue one. Obviously you have to have the legislation, and we've heard from previous speakers that that has been enacted and that is going through your legislature already. Project identification, feasibility assessment, absolutely crucial. And then when you get to the construction monitoring, procurement, the appraisal, operating and monitoring, and then actually a number of our projects are so mature we are reconcessioning them. They are built, they're mature, we're putting them, they come back to government because that's the model. Government is now reconcessioned. So these are the very important procurement stages. I won't bore you with this one. This is one of the toolkits we use to ensure that we get a proper evaluation and benefits, and we have different gateways that the project has to get through in terms of strategy, justification, contract award, and confirming the benefits. But this is all part of the knowledge that we can help to transfer to your unit through the toolkit. Another toolkit that we always use, if somebody says, I want a PPP for the delivery of something, we test it against the normal public service contract, which is the left-hand one. And we look to see, is PPP the right mechanism? And we have a toolkit which does a comparison. So we make no assumptions. We make sure that there is a robust and a very clear analysis already. There is, and I'm glad to say, I was the Lord Mayor of London, one of the global financial centres of the world, there is an appetite for investment in infrastructure, both short, medium and long term, through debts and bonds. But what is hugely important is that projects, as was mentioned by the Finance Minister, are investment grade, are bankable, and that the government uses whatever innovative financing methods it can use at its disposal. And we just heard from the Ministry of Justice building in the previous presentation that an underutilised asset, so the PPP would deliver it and would then rent out space, which would be a counter-subsidy. Well, we do a lot of that, and HS2, our railway going up north-south, a number of the railway stations have actually enhanced the value of the land on either side, and we've captured that value by increasing rates, and that is a counter-subsidy to the delivery of the infrastructure. We call it marriage value. For Crossrail, the London Railway, we've actually put a supplement on business rates, a very small supplement to business rates, and we've done that for 30 years. We've then capitalised that, and that came up with £200 million through the banking system, which then paid for the capital cost. And of course, there's a secondary market in infrastructure assets as well. So recommendations for Namibia: please do work with our Infrastructure Projects Authority. We'll be absolutely delighted to give you oversight, a view, and to help with building up capacity in your unit. Do make an ask. We do have prosperity funds through our international development department. There are a lot of demands on that small fund, but where there is a good ask, well developed, we would be happy to entertain that, and the High Commissioner would be able to make those introductions. The answer isn't always yes, but if you don't ask, you don't get. And UK expertise, we can put together a dream team, not only through the supply chain. We are the 6th largest manufacturing nation in the world, so we have good supply chain, which can tap into UK export finance, whose interest rate is 1%. The condition is that if UK export finance a project, 20% has to be UK content. It used to be 80%, but that's a lot less than many of the other international funders. I think the Chinese rate is 3 to 4%. So we are very competitive, and in fact we do partner with other countries. So we don't build a lot through the United Kingdom, but if there is local contracting capacity here or locally in South Africa or wherever, we will team up with those and provide the expertise that is most suited to our skills and our competitive advantage. And the City of London, through its financing expertise, can create a fund of funds. So what we do is we will bring in other funders with UK exports, whether it's international funders, whether it's private funders, to get a blended rate of capital. So the critical success factors: always be prepared. That financial feasibility study is absolutely vital. To get that right at the beginning is the fundamental building block. Ensure it's bankable. You'll hear it many, many times again. These projects have to be investment grade. The process, the time scale, you can't turn on a sixpence in construction. You need to have adequate time for the market to respond to an opportunity. And what's also important at the bottom there is a stable operating environment. Capital and private sector like predictability, clarity, transparency. They don't like to be spooked by sudden changes in legislation or whatever. So having that constancy is very important. And then this is just a summary, because I know we're short of time. Normally speakers tell you what they've told you, but I'm not going to do that. Don't take too long. Thank you very much.
I would like now to call on to Dr. Andrew Shaw to get into his presentation. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. And what I've been asked to do is share with you some of the experiences of PPPs, but with a particular focus on public enterprises or state-owned companies. It's really a process that's still very much in its infancy, in a certain sense. The PPP model, and I'll talk to really the South African experience, has been very successful. We've had a 10 to 15 year journey where a number of projects have been successfully delivered using a very traditional PPP model, which has focused very much on the involvement of National Treasury. So we've delivered hospitals, prisons, Gautrain. The RPP process has been enormously successful in delivering renewable energy projects, some coal projects, etc. Where the process becomes a little more complex is where you involve the state-owned companies. And maybe the difference here is the view that South Africa has taken from a policy standpoint about the importance of state-owned companies as a driver of economic growth, as opposed to the PPP examples used in other parts of the world where state-owned companies have perhaps even been withdrawn from the system or reduced in size. In the South African example, the state-owned companies are seen to be enormous drivers of economic value, socioeconomic change, etc. So the PPP model applied in the context of those entities has had to shift slightly. And I'm going to go a little bit through that storyline just to explain to you what the implications have been for South Africa particularly. So, I think you're all aware of the PPP project life cycle. It's quite a rigorous, quite an onerous process, in fact, quite a time-consuming process of going through inception, feasibility, procurement, developing a public sector comparator model, identifying whether there's value for money, going out through a bid process. Quite often that bid process can include shortlisting and then identifying a final player. It's really only aligned to very large projects, and it's been most successful in a greenfield type of environment. I need a new hospital, I need a new railway, I need a new solar park. The model works extremely well. Where the model is much more complex is where a state-owned company is given policy responsibility for developing infrastructure in a particular sector of the economy. That might be power, telecoms, or transport. And it doesn't wish to ring-fence a particular part of that investment, pass it out to National Treasury, go through a procurement process, potentially lose some control of that process, and then have to try and address the linkages between that project and the balance of its business. So the need has really emerged for a similar process to the PPP process to be inbuilt within the state-owned enterprise architecture. And that's really where I talk about this process and this change. And what it has resulted is in a process which we call private sector participation. Private sector participation frameworks have been created by National Treasury as a way to use a similar model, but within the context of a state-owned enterprise. So it follows a very similar set of steps, but quite often allows the state-owned enterprise to take equity, which I was quite interested from Sir Michael Beer to hear that is a common thing that's emerging in the UK, is the state-owned enterprises wish to have a stake in this. They often want to do it in a JV type of model to give them control to integrate it into the balance of their business. So if we look at private sector participation as a model, there is great pressure in South Africa, certainly within SADC, for infrastructure to be developed as a delivery agent for economic growth. And we know that as you can address the infrastructure backlog, you can use infrastructure as a way to harness growth in certain sectors. We were power constrained 5 years ago. That was a great challenge for us as a national economy. But, and if you look at the bottom there, that's all South Africa's state-owned companies. Their debt-to-equity ratios are so challenged at the moment that many of them are actually not able to invest in the infrastructure that is necessary to drive that growth. So how can you bring the private sector in to help? Two specific entities, Eskom and Transnet, the largest of our state-owned enterprises, have developed very much behind the public sector participation framework and are rolling out projects which align to the PPP model, but are different in that they are based within the state-owned company, and they often are not ring-fenced in exactly the same very tight ring-fenced way that the traditional PPP model is. It has required that we create a framework which falls outside of the strict PPP delivery model, but that still fits within our Public Finance Management Act, which really governs how things are procured. So pre-feasibility, for example, is very important. Feasibility of the projects, a clear and robust procurement process that's competitive, that's fair, that brings value for money. All of those elements are still as important in the PSP framework as they are in the more traditional PPP framework. Some of the differences, so if we look at public-private partnerships, which are sort of in the middle, and private sector participation frameworks, which are on the right, strategically, the public-private partnership model has been much better at delivering infrastructure where there is a traditional government department behind that. So the government department would identify the need to roll out X number of hospitals. The PPP framework would be set in place. There would be a structure that's set up with National Treasury. A funding model would be set up. And generally those are quite effective greenfield type projects. From a private sector participation framework, you need to augment the public funds in a state-owned company, which generally often have their own revenue streams, with new investments in economic infrastructure. So that's a little bit more challenging. From a financial perspective, the funds raised from private sector are prepaid through fiscal allocations, often within a PPP model, whereas in the state-owned enterprise example or the public enterprises example, the funds are often tied up in the revenue streams that are coming into those entities. So that may be port dues, there may be rail tariffs, there may be energy dues. How do you split that out in a way where you build a PSP somewhere into that process? And some of the examples of where this PSP framework are being tested are new port terminals, the involvement of private sector in some of the value chain for energy. Could be in the downward value chain for ash from coal-fired power stations. It could be in other parts of the transmission network. Where do you involve the private sector effectively as an intermediary in the value chain that the state-owned company is providing? And how do you ensure that the private sector is brought in a way which actually delivers in very close alignment to what the state-owned company requires? And the PPP model is not always structured to do that in a most ideal fashion. The type of infrastructure is mostly PPPs have been effective in social infrastructure, hospitals, etc. It's not entirely true. The IPP example is I would regard as economic infrastructure for power, has been very successful. But the PPP or the PSP model, which is used in state-owned enterprises, is often focused on economic infrastructure, where tariffs are charged to users for services, and so there's a reflection of price back into the need to invest in infrastructure. Some of the guiding principles, so National Treasury has developed what they call a PSP framework, and they've done this collectively with the Department of Public Enterprises, which you have similarly established now in Namibia as a way of managing the state-owned companies that you have reporting to government. And they've done that in a way which tries to meet the needs of the state-owned enterprises but also create a structured program of delivery of private sector participation. So just some guiding principles. Obviously feasibility and ability to yield socioeconomic benefits, value for money, financially viable, and an ability to be managed in such a way that it doesn't create balance sheet constraints that ultimately come back to the fiscus, and that is really challenging, particularly in our constrained environment where most of our state-owned companies are effectively overborrowed. Appropriate risk allocation between parties, the state-owned company and the private sector. Very challenging in an environment where you cannot ring-fence the project very clearly. You actually are trying to split risk in a way where the state-owned enterprise may have different outcomes 5 years down the line from what might have been expected at the beginning of the project. So if you take, for example, rolling stock, the requirement for rolling stock may not be quite the same at the beginning of the period that you anticipated when you started the transaction. So let's say 5 years in, you may require 30% less rolling stock than you require now. How do you manage that? How do you manage that engagement? How do you ensure that the private sector participant in that is involved in a risk share with the state-owned company, which takes into account these diverse needs in terms of operating the state-owned enterprise? So some of the considerations, which at the bottom is SOC capability. Our judgment, and I say this with some caution, right? Our judgment is that most of the state-owned enterprises have very little capability in terms of working with the private sector, and that they really need to build this up and establish capability around private sector participation models where the needs of the private sector are not necessarily met but are understood. Very clear legal requirements, and the legal requirements may extend beyond typical PPP. They may be in return in terms of how risk is shared. They may be in terms of how revenue is shared. There may be contract management, things like penalties for not delivering certain types of service in a particular framework for a state-owned company. And then, of course, procurement. Now, the procurement element for me is still an area that is subject to some experimentation. And I'll explain it in this way. Is in the typical PPP model, the procurement model is very rigorous. It's very onerous, in fact. And what it does is it tries to get to a point where it gets the best value for money from a particular provider of services and infrastructure. In this model, where the state-owned company is often seeking a joint venture or a joint development agreement, it's very difficult to procure simply on the basis of price and service and infrastructure offering, because they're not sure what the private sector may bring to the party. So if a state-owned enterprise wants to, for example, procure a process with a private sector entity, but they don't know exactly what the frame of that delivery model will be. And I wish I could give you a little bit more detail when we're embedded with one of the state-owned enterprises in doing this. They want to actually enter into engagement with the private sector before they actually work out what is the most effective way to deliver a particular project. In other words, use the private sector as an innovator. It is very difficult to have a very structured, clear procurement model. And that's an area that I think for us is the experiment that we are currently facing in the SA example of using state-owned enterprises as a way of procuring the private sector involvement. There's a toolkit in terms of PSPs, and one of the key elements of that toolkit is to establish a portfolio of PSP projects within the larger state-owned enterprises. And that is part of their bigger portfolio of projects. So it needs to be managed in a way where the strategy around PSPs is very integrated with the strategy of the SOE. So in the delivery of, say, an energy value chain, where are the best places to involve the private sector and how should they be involved? What projects should be developed? How should they be phased? When should you bring one project in followed by the next project? All of that really needs to be mapped out, and that becomes a strategic shift and change in the way that the SOEs are now encouraged to work with the private sector. On the right-hand side, you will see a chart which shows percentage private versus percentage state-owned company, and then the years of contracting partnership. And really we're looking for that sweet spot in the middle, which is not unlike many PPP projects. So it's not divestiture, it's not selling assets, And it's not leasing assets for short-term periods on a management contracts. It's taking some reasonable, most often concession-type arrangement somewhere in the middle, but integrating the state-owned company into that concession agreement in a way that the PPP model does not quite do. So generally, say in the case of Gautrain, the PPP framework established the basis under which the railway will be delivered, and then it's left to its own devices with some controlling share above that. In the state-owned enterprise example, the state-owned enterprise needs to have a key play in terms of how that infrastructure and service is delivered, and potentially change it through the life cycle of that concession or that engagement period. And that's the complexity of the model that we now find ourselves in. Another key element, and we'll talk about the success of this, is to bring these projects into the delivery framework of the state-owned enterprise. That means that the board and EXCO must be key elements in designing the PSP policy framework, how these projects are delivered. There's a capital committee that deals with capital broadly within the state-owned enterprise, and then there's a PSP working committee. And the PSP working committee's focus is on innovation, managing the program, which is about portfolio oversight, transaction management, transaction preparation, value for money, essentially following the PPP type delivery model. The next area is program reporting. And the reason that program reporting is so important is because you have PSPs integrated into the delivery of these large state-owned enterprises, is you need to know when they delivered, how they delivered, are they aligned with the time frame of the other projects that may not be PSP orientated. So program reporting is really key to managing the delivery of the state-owned enterprise as a whole. And then governance is the last area. And governance, as I've indicated, around procurement is still a challenge, but clearly governance, managing contracts effectively, ensuring fair and transparent procurement, all of those elements are really all quite critical. The last slide that I wanted to share with you is just some key success factors for sustainable PSP transacting and delivery. And I don't think these are all that different from what you would require in a PPP model, but there are some things that come out quite clearly. And the first one is very strong executive sponsor support. So for these state-owned enterprises, in order for them to initiate these PSP processes, they cannot be hived off to some minor part of the organization where the private sector is asked to do some ring-fenced entity that's not part of the main business of the state-owned enterprise. Strong executive sponsor support needs to be held at board level, and ultimately, in our context, the shareholder needs to be backing that board in terms of that PSP process, because these processes are often have a very political dimension, and unless you have full backing of the state and the state-owned enterprise board in delivering these projects, they're likely not to be successful. So that's a key element. So political champion, public sector funding and support. Some of these projects will require public sector funding. Some of them will require guarantee support from National Treasury. Our example in South Africa is the National Treasury is extremely constrained. So they are looking at these kinds of projects with a very, very tight squeeze on the state-owned enterprises to ensure that debt levels are not increased dramatically. Clear commercial framework for accountability, which is revenue sourcing. In a complex value chain in the state-owned enterprises, defining the revenue that goes back to the private sector participants is really quite important. A strong governance process around approvals and timelines, I've mentioned that in the previous slide. And then transparent and consistent regulatory and political environment. So keeping the whole process clean, clear, unambiguous, very clear risk transfer, reducing any appetite to in some way divert the process, which results in some private sector player getting a better deal than somebody else, are all very, very critical parts of this process. And that is where I would like to leave it. Thank you very much.
Has demonstrated that successful implementation of PPPs requires an enabling environment so that PPPs they may be implemented effectively and with maximum benefit to the public sector. In your view, what are the key factors that constitute a conducive environment, and what are your views on Namibia's environment in that regard?
Well, thank you, Selma, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I think it should be apparent to everyone
from the fact that I do not have a PowerPoint presentation, that I'm the one non-expert up here. That said, I do have some experience having followed this issue in this country for the last few years. And I think that maybe I get to play the role of throwing a little bit of cold water on some of the discussions, the presentations we've had so far. I think that first and foremost, when you talk about what makes an environment conducive, you need to start talking about expectation management. Expectation management in government, in the private sector, and in the public at large. And in that regard, I think there's work to be done here. I can give a few examples. I think there's a lot of confusion in the public, certainly, over what a PPP is. We do hear a lot of talk about it here, and part of the nature of public-private partnerships is there is no one model. And I think that adds to the confusion on the part of the public as to when an official, for example, speaks about PPPs, what are they actually talking about? We have had the experience with the US government of working with the Namibian government over the last now 4 years roughly on a program that is in essence a public-private partnership with the Electricity Control Board and the Ministry of Mines and Energy and with NamPower. You've probably seen reference to it in the media here. It's called REFIT, Renewable Energy Feed-In Tariff, and has led, after several years of preparatory work, has led to the letting of 14 contracts to construct 5 megawatt renewable energy generation facilities. That has been I think, an instructive experience. I'm quite sure it has been for us. I think it has been for the ECB and for NamPower as well. In that, now that we are in the implementation phase and a number of the projects are already online, one of the things we discovered is that some of the investors, the private investors that constructed these facilities, have built a business model that means that they will not be getting any return at all for 6 or 7 years. And that's not the kind of public-private partnership I think that people are talking about when they talk about larger scale infrastructure, for example. There is, I think, a tendency amongst officials here when they talk about PPPs to talk about reasonable rates of return. And one of the things, one of the expectations that needs to be managed, I think, amongst all three groups, the public, the private sector, and government, is that one person's reasonable rate is another person's wholly inadequate rate. And that is, I think, something that is going to have to be addressed as the government moves into actually identifying and pursuing specific public-private partnership projects. Is this just this expectation management? Is, for example, the public prepared to pay for things they don't pay for now? And that, it's not that it can't be done, it's just that it will require a fair amount of work. I think that Namibia nonetheless has a number of positives in terms of the environment. One is the political environment, which is very stable. The judicial system, which is independent and quite professional. The legislative framework, as we've heard described, is now in place and should facilitate quite a bit the development of PPPs. Though I would throw out one question, and this is something I don't know the answer to, it really is just a question. One thing that's unclear to me is the interaction of the new PPP Act with the Public Procurement Act. And I think that as the process moves along, it will be useful for it to be clearer to potential participants as to where those two overlap, if they overlap at all. Another area where I think Namibia has a potential advantage is it's both a positive and a negative. Market size is a driving factor for a lot of PPPs. And Namibia's market by itself is, as we all know, quite small. That makes more challenging the identification and realization of particular PPP projects. And yet, it also has access to a variety of neighboring markets. And as projects are looked at, particularly major infrastructure projects, that will undoubtedly be a factor in determining the bankability of such projects. I think that the perceptions of the local business community, and this goes back to the expectation management issue, are also going to be a factor. There are two trends that I've observed here over the 3 years that I've been here. In terms of local businesses, when they regard economic activity that involves outside investors. Some, not unsurprisingly, I think, tend to see prospective foreign investors as competition. And that is an expectation that needs to be managed when you look at developing PPPs. The other is there is a part of the commercial sector here that has become accustomed to seeing the role of Namibian business in projects that involve the government as being service as a pass-through to foreign contractors. That the Namibian business's role is to get a tender and then turn and subcontract to a foreign contractor. And that, I think, is not going to be part of the PPP process. So that's also, in essence, an expectation that has to be managed. But the good news is that there are, I think, lots of opportunities here. We've seen all these pictures that have been put up in the various presentations. There are opportunities in the power sector, in water, in health, as we've heard, in transportation, I think conceivably in education, that don't necessarily have to be constrained by market size and by the other factors that I've discussed. So on the whole, I'm quite positive about the environment, and I think that what the government is doing with the unit at the Finance Ministry is the best way to approach it.
No, thank you, Ambassador.
A very insightful presentation from the audience. I think the one item that was missing across all three of your presentations is what is the opportunity cost of not having the service that you require as the government? The ambassador mentioned power, so I'll use that as an example. If your cost of electricity is, let's say, $1 per kilowatt hour, then the cost of not having electricity is a factor of 18. The cost of having a blackout is probably 18 times the cost of not having the electricity. And that has to be factored into the selection process, because far too often is the whole process driven towards driving a hard bargain, make sure the investor doesn't get too high of a return, not keeping in mind that if you don't get the service, the cost to the economy and to the country is enormous.
Well, if I could answer generally, what we found in the United Kingdom under the social PPP delivery pipeline is we have a number of projects whose benefit are very much geared towards the added value to the economy. I'll give you an example of, in fact, a road, not a power plant, where we had a section of road, a 50-mile section of road, that we didn't want to toll, but it actually linked, in the north of the United Kingdom, factories. Without access to that road, the factories couldn't operate, people couldn't get to work, they couldn't deliver logistically their output. So the road was actually funded with a shadow toll. So the government basically asked the private sector to build and deliver the road, and the revenue to the private sector came from a satellite that counted the traffic movements. The risk to the public sector was that we, the private sector, had to build a model. We took all the risk on those traffic movements, but we had real experts that actually had analysed 20 years of movements, and we got it more or less right. So that is a case in point where the added value to the economy, to the local economy, to jobs, to prosperity was the key driver, rather than the monetary financial cash flow that came out of it. And in fact, it was effectively renting an asset back to government for 35 years, and that was paid out of the public purse through local rates. The same applies to many others, but that's really the social PPP program, as opposed to the one where the user pays.
So if I may add a quick comment there, I think this the observation is absolutely correct that I believe without exception the most expensive thing to do is to not build an infrastructure which is required. Having said that, I believe one scope of the question is, are we doing everything that we can in order to bring these investment opportunities to market, if they are user pay and if there is a private investment angle to it, or otherwise if we are using our public finances in a manner that we are able to deploy as much money as possible to public infrastructure projects. But to your second point of what is the profitability of the private sector, I would like to just refer to one of the other very obvious and known objectives of the government is to see, government is essentially an agency of the public. So it is its duty to provide the best value for money. It is not about unreasonably squeezing the private sector, but it is about creating a framework that we are able to understand what is the best deal that the government can strike on behalf of public at large. And therefore, if there is a toll, for instance, a toll road which is user financed, or if there is an energy project, we are getting that infrastructure at the least cost possible. Our minister always or often mentions that we, for instance, have a relatively high cost of energy in Namibia, and the better deals we strike, we would be able to get energy into the system at a level where our industries are competitive in the region. So it's the comprehensive understanding of the constraints and objectives, and then how we respond to those objectives that's important for us.
Thank you very much. Is there another question?
Yes, good morning. My name is Engela Dayambo. I represent a company called J Maynard. We are one of the world players in PPP advisories. I've got one question out of the 5. I'll stick to one. I just want clarity on the issue of unsolicited bids. The rationale is the following. I take it that in this country for now, be it in the public sector or the private sector, the issue or the understanding of what PPP procurement potential can be is still not mature. I'm assuming then that if you sit in the public sector, you might not know upfront what are the potential viable PPP opportunities. But someone in the private sector who has been doing PPP would have that advantage. Now, can we then not say that we would not want unsolicited bids? I agree with that. But what about unsolicited proposals? So that when I submit an unsolicited proposal, then that proposal can be, a notice can be given in a newspaper and say there is this unsolicited proposal. Whoever is also interested in participating, you are welcome to bid. That's my suggestion. And to link that way, we also need to accelerate the implementation of PPP. I take cognizance and appreciate the projects that has been highlighted. That's very good. But there are many other opportunities that are lying around. Now, for us to fast track that, I suggest that we need to do sectoral PPP strategies. Going to sanitation and waste, and get an expert in that who will then tell the country, be it private and public sector, and say what are the opportunities of PPP and what are the possible models that can let us address the 2030 targets of sanitation. I'm just making an example. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Shaw. Sir, there.
Look, I think that unsolicited bids or even unsolicited proposals are very controversial because essentially in a kind of competitive procurement process, they make an argument that there's one particular bidder who has an advantage over others purely because they put the bid forward. And it may be, as you've indicated, that maturity is the mechanism for resolving that issue. There is an unsolicited bid process available in South Africa for toll roads. No one's ever used it, right? It's in the Act. You can put forward an unsolicited bid for a toll road in South Africa. No one's ever actually put anything forward. I think the point that you make around sector plans is very valuable, and I think that's spot on. And I think integrated into that is very important to bring the state-owned enterprises that are in those different sectors to the party, because what's clear to me is that you have to have some sector drive, which includes the key delivery agents of the state, in determining what makes sense from a PPP perspective.
Sorry, I think that's a really important point you've raised, and the UK experience is quite complicated in this area, because at the one hand we like to encourage innovation and creativity from the different sectors. So we are always entertaining at government level and in department level proposals for doing things better, for delivering better, for having new approaches. But when it actually comes to bids and actual being awarded work, that's when the complication arises. And there have been a number of instances in the United Kingdom where an innovation, a creative approach has been made to government to do things in a certain way that saves money, is more efficient, more effective, works better for the people, which we've then put into the pipeline of projects that then go out to tender. And what it does is it allows the proposer of that particular unsolicited approach to have a seat at the table, but not necessarily to own the table.